Hello, in this video we will be talking about the Rockefellers and the Reds, Chapter 6 of Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And then let me start off this discussion of this chapter by reading a little passage from page 115, in which Gary Allen writes, and I quote, "Stalin paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the United States to Soviet industry before and during the war. He said that about two-thirds of all large industry enterprise in the Soviet Union had been built with U.S. help or technological assistance." On page 115, Allen continues, "For 50 years, the Federal Reserve CFR Rockefeller inside crowd has advocated and carried out policies aimed at increasing the power of their satellites, the Soviet Union." Right, their satellite, the Soviet Union. "Meanwhile, Americans spend $75 billion a year in defense to protect itself from the enemy the insiders are building up." And of course, in both these situations, the bankers and the corporatists become wealthier. And of course, once communism collapsed, they could no longer use that, right? They could no longer use it. A good documentary to watch about that is Adam Curtis's The Power of Nightmares, right? The Power of Nightmares, a BBC documentary. It is Adam Curtis, because Dan Curtis is the horror film director. It's Adam Curtis who is the BBC producer, right? But in that video, he talks about how they needed to create a new enemy. A new enemy must be created, right? And so I think was it Leo Strauss? There were some people, I think Strauss was one of them, who talked about how the importance of creating a new enemy. The new enemy would become the Islamic terrorists, right? They would replace the Soviet Union. They would replace communism as the fear in the minds of Americans, as a way, in my view, for the corporations to make lots of money. If Francis Fukuyama says it's the end of history, as he does, and he writes a nice piece on that, he also leaves open the possibility of Islamic terrorists being the threat. And of course, they become the threat. Become the big threat, the threat that all Americans are now supposed to fear like they once feared the Reds, right? Now we fear the brown-colored people that live in the Middle East and worship Allah, supposedly. Even though, of course, the only way they can attack America is by hitting planes in the buildings, which seems very illogical, because if I was a terrorist and I wanted to terrify Americans, I would engage in lots of other activities, usually activities that would destroy America's personal possessions, right? Molotov cocktails through windows of houses would be a far more efficient way of terrorizing most American people who really love their physical possessions. But it would also maybe mobilize towns and town militias and get people involved in protecting their communities, engaging in Jeffersonian democracy, people going out and buying firearms. So that, of course, would not be something most terrorists would want to do, would it? Not because the terrorists wouldn't, but because if the terrorists themselves are not really terrorists, but really funded by powerful corporate business interests in America, that wouldn't be such a good idea, would it? Because, of course, Al-Qaeda was founded by the CIA. Now, whether you say that Al-Qaeda is still functioning or Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization is still functioning as an arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, I have no idea about that. But the fact that it was created by the Central Intelligence Agency seems to indicate to me the possibility, at least, that their power does come from the CIA. That they may be Al-CIA rather than just Al-Qaeda. Don't know for certain, but one could guesstimate on that point. Certainly, I'm very suspicious about Osama bin Laden really being killed in a recent raid, right? Because of his kidney dialysis in 2001. I think probably bin Laden died far before 2010. Although it's not really relevant that he did. I mean, it's a trite issue, except for the fact that you look at how Americans responded to Osama bin Laden's death. They showed their zombified, hypnotized stances, right? Going out and partying, getting Osama bin Laden's name mixed up with Barack Obama's name or Saddam Hussein's name. It was awful. And if you ask these same people the point where Pakistan was on a map, you probably would have 1 in 5 being actually able to do so. And I'm not trying to be derogatory to my fellow Americans. I'm just saying most people in this country are damn stupid. And they don't know geography, put it that way. That's provable. Just go out and start asking people basic geographical facts, and they have no idea. But anyway, on page 117, Allen notes that the United States has been financing and equipping both sides of the terrible Vietnam War, killing its own soldiers by proxy. I certainly agree with that. I'd also note Noam Chomsky's from Manufacturing Consent talking about how the United States did nothing to prevent the Indonesians from attacking the East Timinian people and slaughtering them in a mass number. Of course, it didn't even make U.S. news. This genocidal action. In fact, the United States corporations actually gave weapons to the Indonesians in order to attack the East Timinian people and assassinate them. So clearly, it definitely seems to me to be a conspiratorial element here. You don't even have to buy Gary Allen. I think you can read Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky is really brilliant on these issues as well. But anyway, as Allen notes on page 120, It's nearly 50,000 Americans have died in Vietnam, many of them killed by weapons which the Rockefellers directly or indirectly supplied to avowed enemies, right? And the idea is, of course, that if it would have been a declared war, that would have been called treason. But of course, because it wasn't declared, Vietnam War wasn't declared, they can get out of really calling it treason, which is, in Allen's, I think, view, probably one of the reasons why many of these wars that the United States fights have not been declared wars, because that way, when they're not declared, the corporatists can fund both sides of the fight, right? And legally do so without being accused of treason. Although, considering that Julian Deschamps was accused of treason, even though he wasn't a U.S. citizen, I suppose I'm being a little too kind. I mean, maybe we can accuse anybody of treason in this country, can't we? Even people that aren't even U.S. citizens, and thereby couldn't possibly be treasonous to a country which they've never pledged allegiance. But anyway, I digress once more. On page 121, Allen writes that a few days after David Rockefeller, right, ended his vacation in the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev was recalled from vacation at the Black Sea resort to London. He had been fired. Of course, Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the USSR at that time, right? So one questions, did David Rockefeller journey to the Soviet Union to fire an employee, right? I mean, obviously the position of premier in the Soviet Union is a figurehead with a true power residing elsewhere, perhaps in New York. That's, of course, again, these are Allen's views, not necessarily mine. I think, though, it's an interesting theory. I don't think Allen in the text, at least, sufficiently supports the theory, but it may be true. I don't know. It's an interesting theory, and I certainly don't have any desire to believe, and I don't have any evidence that would suggest to me that the Rockefellers are kind, benevolent people, right? Or that the Rothschilds are, or that Bill Gates today is. I think these people are interested in a certain policy, a certain agenda for the world, and I don't think it's an agenda that most of the world's population would particularly appreciate. Well, on page 121, Allen gives a very good metaphoric example. He says that for 5 decades, the communists have based their propaganda on the theme that they were going to destroy the Rockefellers and the other super rich. Yet we find that for 5 decades, the Rockefellers have been involved in building the strength of the Soviets. We are supposed to believe these international cartelists do this because they are foolish or greedy. Does this make sense? If a criminal goes up and down the street shouting at the top of his lungs, right, that as soon as he gets hold of a gun, he's going to kill Joe Dokes, and you learn that Dokes is secretly giving guns to the criminal, one of two things must be true. Either Dokes is a fool, or all the shouting is just so-called showbiz, and the criminal secretly works for Dokes. The Rockefellers are not fools. That's an interesting passage, I thought. Page 122, Allen argues that Nelson Rockefeller controls Richard Nixon. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly Nixon seemed to become far more favorable to Nelson Rockefeller's positions once he became president of the United States. But anyway, I mean, after all, I know that could be the result of Kissinger, right? But at the same time, on page 125, then, Allen notes that the Kissinger appointment was arranged by Nelson Rockefeller. And he quotes this from the Salt Lake City Desert News, March 27, 1970. Kissinger had served for 5 years as Rockefeller's personal advisor in foreign affairs, and at the time of his appointment was serving as a paid staff member of the Council of Foreign Relations. On page 126, then, Allen notes that Kissinger is the very embodiment of everything Nixon denounced during his 1968 campaign. And so, you know, there is a possibility that Kissinger became, Secretary of State as a result of Nelson Rockefeller's influence, and very possibly, you know, Nixon sold himself. Very, very possibly he sold himself. And Nixon's not stupid either, just as I would say Nixon might have been paranoid. Breaking the Watergate would seem to indicate he was paranoid about getting reelected because he won by a landslide. But at the same time, I thought that there were a lot of interesting points in that last chapter worthy of consideration. Certainly, we see that Nixon administration did not radically transform itself from because before Nixon we had Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and then John Fitzgerald Kennedy before Johnson, and so Nixon seemed to continue these policies, right? Nixon did continued Henry Kissinger kind of policies, Nelson Rockefeller kind of policies, and so that seems definitely to me the fact that that's interesting, right? We didn't have any change, and that makes one question about where the power structure really lies. Well, in Chapter 7, we're going to talk about pressure from above and pressure from below, and then we're going to also talk about You Are the Answer, Chapter 8, so the last 2 chapters of the 9-Day Conspiracy. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.